My top 10 games list is going to consist of games I enjoyed the most, games I keep coming back to play or want to come back to, not just because they have New Game Plus or extra content, but because they were so much fun to begin with that I want to keep playing them. The games also have to be good at launch, with no DLC or updates needed to fully enjoy them. I'm not giving credit to companies that take pre-order money, release something unfinished, and then collect the cash over time and just slowly patch it over a year or so. The experience must also be good by itself or with a random group of players if it's multiplayer. It can't be in my top 10 if it's only fun when you play with friends, cause that's every game. I should reiterate that I've beaten the main campaign for every single game on this list, as well as my top 20, if you haven't seen that video yet. So let's get started. For number 10, we have Hollow Knight. Wanna know why this list took so damn long to come out? Well, for one, I didn't know if I was gonna make it or not. And number 2, there were several games I wanted to finish in order to finalize the list, and this game was one of them. Now, Hollow Knight came out a while ago, and I kept dropping it, partly because I've lost my save twice now. One was the game's fault, and one was my fault. But it didn't matter because I kept wanting to start it back up and play it again because I enjoyed the core gameplay so damn much, a testament to how good it is. The size of this game is huge, even for a Metroidvania. Every time you feel like you're getting somewhere, you find another massive new area to explore between the cracks of places you've been through countless times. The sheer wall of content for just the main story is impressive, but the side content for the special endings is staggering. Add to that the free DLC, and you got one of the biggest Metroidvanias I've ever played. Sometimes I couldn't tell if what I was playing was DLC or just part of the main game. It's that big and seamless. There was actually a clear-cut way to the ending of the game, but I swear I didn't realize it. You gotta kill 3 bosses, but you might as well do tons of side content to power up your guy anyway, because one of these bosses is pretty tough. If this game has one major fault, it's that sometimes it can be a bit too big. You got fast travel, but sometimes there are areas where it takes a long time to get through, even with all the special world traversing abilities. I get that they want to have some areas difficult to backtrack through, but oftentimes there's no challenge to it. You're just kind of wading through these long hallways without being able to just kind of blast through them, with a few exceptions. Another problem I hear people complain about is that the game is directionless in teaching you its mechanics. The game has a very simplistic combat system, so while you're doing basic maneuvers, it's very easy to discover new ways of traversing the map, like bouncing off spikes by hitting them with your nail and using the knockback to get to different areas. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. The game rewards experimentation and exploration, like any other Metroidvania. There's hardly any RPG elements here, so it's mostly based on your reflexes, but you can find items to increase your odds of winning, provided you're willing to explore every nook and cranny to get them. Still an immensely enjoyable game if you like the exploration and platforming as the main mechanic of a game. And I love how when you beat the final boss, the game doesn't straight up end. You get sort of this pseudo New Game Plus where you can go and fight the final boss again, or you can go back and do the DLC areas to unlock these special endings. This game is easily my top 3 favorite Metroidvanias of all time for the sheer wall of content and atmosphere it gives off. The ambient sound and music is absolutely fantastic and really sells some of the areas. Hollow Knight is an absolute gem of a game. It is not overrated like some people would lead you to believe. It's very fun, and I cannot wait for Silksong. Coming in at number 9, we have Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. To be honest, I'm stunned. I used to play Melee with my brother and friends all the damn time back in the day, and unlike Brawl, it held up really well when I came back to it. As far as core gameplay goes, Smash Ultimate is the best in the franchise to date, and it's everything Smash 4 on Wii U should have or try to be. A great mix of Smash's finest moments in the series. You have the tight gameplay and extra modes from Melee, the top-tier graphics and presentation from Brawl. You even brought back all the cool stages from 64 and put every character from each game up until this point in one place, with more content coming in through free updates and DLC. Obviously, you are missing a subspace emissary-style story mode, and instead we got a strange mix of adventure mode and stadium events. But the World of Light adventure mode is still a lot of fun, especially for unlocking the 74 playable characters. It's hard to think of what Smash 6 will be like. How could they ever top this one? I don't have much to say here. It's Smash Brothers. You either like it or you don't at this point. Jesus. At number 8, we gotta go with Resident Evil 2, the remake. Now, let me explain. The remake of Resident Evil 1 on the GameCube, which I just finished last year, might be my favorite Resident Evil game, and it should be here considering there was a PC port of it. But honestly, we're talking about a port of a remake of the original. It's kind of a stretch putting it on here. Plus, RE1 has its own share of frustration, especially due to not having any checkpoints and the tank controls being extremely frustrating if you've never played them when they were new. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 2 is damn near perfect in many aspects because it is not in the least bit frustrating to play, except maybe on the highest difficulty. I felt that for my first playthrough, normal was a good enough challenge, with only 1 or 2 parts actually being frustrating, like the crane battle with Leon and the Sherry segment. The replay value, while some may argue is worse than the original, is still good here. I've put about 30 hours into this game, and I have tons of fun every time I boot it up again. In fact, when I was getting footage for this video, I wanted to keep playing it more and more, and I didn't want to stop. The strategies for conserving ammo, mapping out the quickest routes through each new level, and balancing your inventory is just incredibly appealing to me. The sound design is absolutely fantastic. Mr. X is a great addition to this as well, and he's just a great addition to the game in general, making the game a lot more tense and the atmosphere really strong. The only complaints I might have from someone who never played the original series is the gunplay and music. I've listened to a bit of the original Resident Evil 2 soundtrack, and it is way better, way more recognizable and memorable than what we've got here. The gunplay, primarily the sound design, as well in Resident Evil 2 the remake, is pretty weak. Other than that, there's not that much I can criticize about it because it was just so much damn fun to play. It's what got me back into finishing video games because, again, how satisfying it was to finish it and then replay it again. It was just unparalleled. I absolutely loved this game, and for that reason, obviously, it's going to be number 8 on the list. For number 7, there is only Prejudice. Section 8 Prejudice. Good lord, was this an amazing game. I say was, you can still technically buy and play it, but the multiplayer is dead due to it being tied to Games for Windows Live, an ungodly service in DRM that killed a number of gaming communities when services for the official piece of software shut down, and publishers didn't see to it that their games were patched and moved over to Steamworks for continuous online play. Developer Timegate Studios are also no longer around either. It was also published by Atari, so you bet your ass this game will never see a proper update or successor ever again. Despite its short-lived life, Section 8 Prejudice was the pinnacle of multiplayer-only pay-up-front gaming. To this day, it still obliterates most of the full-priced $60 multiplayer-only AAA releases in terms of content and fun factor. For $14.99, you got pure fucking crack on a disc. Want to spawn? Drop in from the sky. Want to hold an objective? Drop in some turrets and even AA guns to shoot down other players when they're spawning. Want to get somewhere fast? Activate your overdrive sprinting mode and slam into other players and kill them. Tired of people jetpacking out of your crosshair? Use the gun lock-on system. Sick of just capturing points? The map has changing objectives like enemy assassination, convoy, and all sorts of shit. The price of $15 to have this much fun feels like a crime. This game to me symbolizes why I will never, ever go easy on multiplayer-only games like Evolve or Titanfall 1 that release at $60 with bare-bones content and community support. Section 8 Prejudice came out years before, had more content, had better content, had a campaign that served as a glorified tutorial to get you into the game, and it was still $15 motherfucking dollars. It absolutely deserves to be in my top 10. Had the multiplayer been converted to Steamworks at some point, and had it received a little bit of extra content, like modding support, not only would I still be playing, but it might have been my multiplayer shooter of the decade. At number 6, we have quite possibly one of the greatest games ever made by mankind.
Stop that blade! Ahead! Ahead! Swinging wide open! Хорошо. Very good. But do not rest easy just yet, huh?
Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. This is probably the closest I've ever gotten in a video game to popping a boner without there being tits on the screen. This is the hypest fucking game I've ever played. The boss fights coupled with their own music that changes as you progress through a battle makes for incredibly memorable fights.
Africa's just getting a bit too peaceful.
And the dialogue is fucking over the top and insane, I love it. But the music is so goddamn amazing that it easily makes my soundtrack of the decade. The core gameplay is fun, but admittedly not as deep as developer Platinum's other character action games, and it is quite short, but the real value comes from playing it over and over again. Enemy types and placements are switched up on higher difficulty levels, and of course, it's easy to jump back into a boss fight through the level select screen. The bosses really are just so much goddamn fun and hype. The game is memorable just from the boss fights themselves, on their own. May I ask, why is this game not at number 1 with such high praise? Well, to put it simply, I'm not a big fan of these character action games, especially from Platinum. I'll play God Hand or Metal Gear Rising because they divert from the usual formula found in something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, or at the very least they are much simpler to grasp and make you feel like you're actually doing rather well as opposed to feeling like you're playing the game poorly, even though you're clearing levels just fine. So, for going beyond liking, even adoring a game out of my comfort zone, it's easy to put Metal Gear Rising on my list, and it well deserves number 6. It's just a goddamn shame that we will never, ever see a proper sequel to this game ever again. And if we do, it might not be as good as the original. What a shit world we live in. Thanks a lot, Konami.
I'll put you under, weakling. Now what? Jack Ripper. You're dead! Get off! Go and shoot, please!
Alright, look, I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I have no way to follow that up, so we're just gonna move on, okay? We're just gonna move on. For number 5, we have Titanfall 2. Okay, I know, I just got done shitting on games like this, you know, AAA, $60, multiplayer only, but Titanfall 2 really stepped it up over the original game. We used to get games with fully fledged single and multiplayer components for our $60 without microtransactions and season passes, and each component was usually good, and sometimes we'd also get co-op. Titanfall 2 comes to a very close return to that age, dropping the season pass that divides the multiplayer community, puts effort into its campaign that adds to the universe of the game, while also delivering something engaging. The campaign is quite short, but it's really fun and memorable. It never slows the action down except in just a handful of moments that are surprisingly emotional and well presented. The multiplayer is on the level of the original in terms of core gunplay and even better at times. While the unlock system is not my thing, it's still better than the newer Call of Duty games. Titan combat has been expanded upon significantly with new tech and mechanics to maintain a very fun and respectable skill ceiling. The ground combat is of course razor sharp with movement options for new players being accessible to avoid Titans, while skilled players can take advantage of the very fluid controls to fill a variety of different loadout types. Titanfall is not only number 5 on my list, but it is easily my online shooter of the decade. Battlefield 1 might have been put here instead had it been what it is now at launch. The game was sorely lacking in worthwhile content, whereas Titanfall 2 had a good starting point out of the gate. My only complaint is that the long-term updates and support were cut short by EA because they decided to send this game out to die by having it compete with Battlefield 1. So, thanks again EA for destroying another franchise with potential. I know Respawn probably thinks the same way. For number 4, we have Persona 4 Golden for the PlayStation Vita. I know I'm technically breaking my rule here. It's not the vanilla game, it's a game with patches and extra content, but You know what? They took a console game, trimmed it down for a handheld, and still made it superior to its console counterpart with tons of extra content and features. It's not like Persona 3 Portable, where there's been content cut or changed despite being improved in many respects. Persona 4 Golden as a portable game is absolutely incredible. It's such an improvement, I can't see myself playing the original given how many improvements they've made in this game. As for the game itself, the story mode is very engaging for the 70 to 80 hours you will be playing through it. I found the main characters to have more dialogue that bounced off each other than in Persona 5, and I enjoyed the story progression of each character more than I did with Persona 3. And aside from the vocal tracks for the music being the best in 3, I think 4 has the best music period. A solid range of earworm tunes coupled with an excellent English dub that had some redubbing done to further enhance the quality of this port. The core combat is still Persona. I'm more of an SRPG guy, never cared for the turn-based combat, especially when it's a bit slow, but the options to fast forward through some of the game's more tedious parts, as well as the addition of new checkpoints, alleviates a ton of frustration that was present in 3 and the vanilla version of 4. It's hard to really point out problems with this game, other than the fact that it's one of the easiest of the bunch, and it's a lot easier than the other SMT mainline games. It not only deserves number 4 on my list, but it is my handheld game of the decade. For number 3, beginning to wrap it up, we have Fallout New Vegas. Man, what a trip this game was. You know, every time I go back to this one, for any reason, like capturing footage, I want to just keep playing for hours upon hours, trying to find anything else I've missed. I love this game. New Vegas is 10 years old, and to me it harkens back to a time when I had much less disdain for Western AAA developed games. Even though it was still buggy as hell, there's still so much fun to be had here. This is partly because there's so many quests and many of them are open-ended. The writing really makes the game here. There's just that tiny bit of extra detail to each character that makes them glow and stand out compared to games like Fallout 3, which I also felt was a terrific game but had so many drawbacks when it came to the writing, especially its ending before it got the Broken Steel update that addressed many of its problems. While we're on the subject of Fallout 3, it and New Vegas, like Brutal Legend before them, got me into an entirely new world of music in addition to the absolutely stellar original score each game had to really push the intensity and the atmosphere of a post-apocalyptic world. They also had that very distinct music from the era the games tried to replicate. The Ink Spots, D. Martin, Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, an absolutely amazing choice of tracks. But funny enough, New Vegas got me into country music of all things through motherfucking Big Iron Marty Robbins, who since has become my second favorite musician of all time. There are some criticisms I still hold for New Vegas. It is still very buggy, and unless you're really looking for them, there's not a whole lot of those really amazing quests outside of the main story and faction content. In fact, the faction quests feel less like side quests and are actually required for the full enjoyment of the game, seeing as how you could very quickly complete the main storyline and hardly touch the side stuff. The main story should have been a bit longer, with more twists and turns, rather than just feeling like everything comes to a halt when you get to New Vegas, and it's only a matter of choice when you want the game to end. Still, it's fun to explore the wasteland and do all the side quests and discover everything, because it's always very rewarding. So there you have it, Fallout New Vegas, worthy of number 3 despite its flaws. I just wish I could experience it again, fresh, because Lord knows the new games don't come anywhere close to what New Vegas started with. What the fuck? Get this out of the way. The first Dark Souls is an incredibly flawed game. The latter half of this game, with a few exceptions, is objectively terrible or unfinished with some terrible boss fights and level design. There's a few exceptions to this rule, but it still has one of the worst boss designs and levels I've seen in a video game. The remastered edition was a cash grab and a wasted opportunity to fix the game. The online never worked properly. The technical frame rate of this game is a stitched-together nightmare on both console and PC, with terrible performance on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, especially in places like Blighttown, and even having games for Windows Live on launch for PC with a frame rate lock and even performance issues on the highest-end PCs in places like Lost Islet. broken physics when trying to unlock the frame rate. It was a nightmare. And it still to this day is unless you mod it. So unless you're comfortable with playing the entire game at 30 FPS, you're going to want to do that. The game, in many regards, is a mess, but sometimes the greatest games are the most flawed, because we soldier through the worst parts because there is a game really worth tolerating a lot of shit for. Dark Souls is one of those games, and it's one of the most impressive games I've ever played. It was a complete breath of fresh air when I got around to playing it. I can remember that amazing rush after beating the third boss by myself without any guidance or help. Dark Souls is a tough game, but it being an RPG lowers the overall frustration a lot more than you'd think. Enemies have weaknesses, your character can be improved just a little bit with new weapons and armor to change up your playstyle when fighting new enemies and bosses. What's better is that you can get through most of the game with just the starting weapons, and you don't have to be a masochist to do it, you just have to upgrade them a little bit. In a game like Castlevania on the NES, which is one of my favorite games, it's all about mastering the control and learning enemy attack patterns. Dark Souls has a much lower curve on these essentials by comparison because attacks are telegraphed better in boss fights, and the general feel of the weapon feels amazing to use. It doesn't feel clunky and slow like Castlevania does. It honestly feels like a 3D Castlevania in some regards if you mix Symphony of the Night's spiderweb level design with the difficulty of Castlevania 1 on NES. However, the absolute showstopper for me was the game's absolutely stellar atmosphere and world building. You aren't hammered with tons of exposition or cutscenes. Instead, you challenge this dying world at your own pace and slowly uncover its history through item descriptions and character dialogue. The sound design for each area highlights a range of moods that perfectly match the absolutely incredible art direction done for each of the levels and enemies. An absolute masterpiece for what it does right, and still worth playing through, even if it does almost everything wrong in the latter half. So far, no game has quite matched Dark Souls 1 for me in this franchise. Dark Souls 2 was fun, but extremely uninspired. 3's A-game material felt like it was just retreading the good parts of 1. Demon's Souls is very, very close, but that game needs a remaster, badly. Bloodborne's combat on a system like the PlayStation 4 does not work well with terrible frame pacing, motion blur, and chromatic aberration. One of the few games I did not enjoy due to its technical limitations, unlike Dark Souls, and Sekiro's first few hours did not hook me in the slightest. Dark Souls is still the game to beat. It pretty much spawned its own genre, and nothing, not even its own developers, can outdo what it did. It absolutely belongs in the number 2 spot on my list. If the game was properly remastered or remade and had most of its problems fixed, this might have been not only one of my favorite games of the decade, but my favorite game of all time. Speaking of which, alright, my game of the decade. It is not a perfect game. In many ways, the story is quite uninspired. The characters have been made way less interesting from its predecessor, and any attempts at newer characters just feel half-assed, and furthermore, it feels like a piece of a bigger game, rather than one complete part of a 3-part saga as intended thanks to mishandling from its publisher. But what this game did for the genre has not been topped in the 10 years it has been out on the market. My number 1 game of the decade is...
Make no mistake. War is coming. With all its glory. And all its horror. Mr. Findlay, your freedom awaits.
Hell, it's about time.
StarCraft II: Wings of Liberty. StarCraft II: Wings of Liberty lived up to all the hype I had for it and was one of the last games to do so, along with Halo Reach, all the way back in 2010. Everything regarding the gameplay was absolutely stellar. From the sound design and music, the controls and physics, to the core, base building, and unit management, for me, was the best I'd ever seen in a strategy game when I first fired it up on my aging PC from 2005, equipped with a video card with only 256 megabytes of video RAM. The game scaled impressively well when it came out, considering how good it looked. The presentation in general was absolutely stellar. The graphics were top-notch for the time, and even 10 years later, they still look great. But once again, the showstopper is the gameplay. StarCraft II's single-player campaign is a really fun time, with objective-based levels that, while might be a little bit formulaic, make the game a lot less tedious to play, considering that here, the AI and level design are handled differently than its predecessor. Just about every mission tries to bring something new and unique to the table, forcing you to change strategy to fit the objective. While some missions do devolve a bit into spamming one type of unit, it's still challenging and fun, especially on the hard and brutal difficulties, and of course, you have the absolutely stellar defensive missions, absolutely mandatory in an RTS, and done perfectly here. Holding out against swarms of enemies until the timer runs out is always fun, and here it's done masterfully. The bonus objectives add a layer of RPG elements to the game. Doing these objectives adds to your research or credits as you play the campaign, getting you access to trees of new units and abilities to play around with. The game didn't just stop here, with custom games and multiplayer adding to the value. While I didn't get into the multiplayer until Heart of the Swarm, and I didn't find custom games to be as diverse and intricate as what was done in Warcraft 3's level editor, they were still fun distractions, and the game alone was worth it just for the stellar gameplay found in the campaign. While the first expansion to this game was a bit disappointing with far less missions, variety, and less replay value, the second expansion, Legacy of the Void, was a fantastic finale with a great prologue campaign, a fantastic Protoss main campaign, and a really nice bonus epilogue campaign. The additions to the game have vastly improved it since launch, like the collectible screen allowing you to unlock and manage new skins for units, announcers, HUDs, and other cool stuff. The addition of co-op was a fantastic decision, letting you get your fix of much more challenging gameplay, and of course, the choice of smaller expansions like the Nova campaign was a great idea considering how creative and fun it was. I've been out of the meta regarding multiplayer for a while, but I easily put 100 or 2 hours into the Heart of the Swarm multiplayer when it was new. It had its problems, but it was still a ton of fun once you started to learn the game, even more so when you were fighting people who were at your skill level. It was an absolute rush. StarCraft II Wings of Liberty, the vanilla game, is absolutely worthy of Game of the Decade despite its weak attempts at storytelling and character progression, because it absolutely makes up for it in the gameplay department. In addition to this, with the expansions, with the updates, while they didn't improve upon the characters and story very much, the expansions added so much to the overall game that not only is Wings of Liberty, the base game from 2010, my Game of the Decade, but StarCraft II, with all the updates and expansions as a complete set, as one piece of software, is my favorite game of all time. It's been a long 10 years, and very few games have had me coming back to them this often. StarCraft II exemplifies near perfect gameplay. You may still see StarCraft Brood War as the better game, and you know what? Considering how much different the gameplay is, they are even harder to compare, as StarCraft 1's level design is less scripted and restrictive. It's one of the greatest games of that era of RTS. It's very much down to personal preference, but I feel that StarCraft 2 is the pinnacle of its era, as StarCraft Brood War was for its era. Both are phenomenal games. It's just a shame that Blizzard's glory pretty much ended for me after this decade. They would still be trendsetters for genres like multiplayer hero shooters and online trading card games, but they feel like flashes in the pan in retrospect, with the bad starting to outweigh the good in the last decade. Nevertheless, StarCraft II is my game of the decade, and with all the expansions, it is my favorite game of all time. What a way to start and end the decade. I might be a bit jaded in saying that this past decade wasn't super great for video games. Yeah, there were some amazing ones that came out, but the new console generation was pretty disappointing, to be honest. The number of exclusive titles we usually got was dropped down, so we saw fewer must-have titles on each platform. And even outside of this new generation of hardware, there were still problems. 2011 brought us nothing but sequelitis with plenty of safe trilogies. Way more games came out unfinished earlier this decade. It wasn't as bad as the 1980s video game crash, but with 2014's era of AAA blunders coupled with Steam, Sony, and Microsoft letting more terrible titles hit their store page, it felt like we were on our way to another crash, and Let's not forget that throughout the decade, the industry went all out in really pushing these new or pre-existing shitty practices such as microtransactions, always online DRM, on-disc DLC, season passes, online passes, and who could forget loot boxes. I think the most offensive one, though, that we might see more of this decade is games as a service. The idea of releasing games that have all this revenue and content planned in advance without the game itself being any good to begin with just seems self-destructive to me. Why is it that of all games that get released, the ones that get almost no DLC end up being the best? Because they're sold from day one as complete experiences without any strings attached. And if DLC is sold, it's done as an afterthought or usually planned out way down the line. Games like Anthem or Battlefront 2, where even after tons of updates and fixes, the games are still fundamentally flawed and fucking terrible. They're not fun to play. I don't care how many times people come up to me and say, yo, dude, Battlefront 2, EA Battlefront 2 is so much better now. No, it's not. It's still the same repetitive bullshit. They've just added more stuff on top of it. I'm sure many of us would rather go back to the early 2000s with the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, where games on each platform were still distinct, where season passes and microtransactions were almost impossible to even sell, where PC gaming was more niche and had things like server browsers and developers that would release source code or modding tools for their massive communities. But despite the tougher times in recent years, we still got great games that rivaled our most beloved childhood memories, and I will always treasure them. From the midnight launch of StarCraft II, to coming home from school, to opening my legendary edition of Halo Reach, to my friends showing me how to beat the Tauros demon for the first time in Dark Souls, I will never forget any of these, and there will always be hope for better games and more memories. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. I'm out.